book, The World is for Sale, is Chapter 1, Part 2. Initially, the grain exports went to U.S. allies, but soon Cargill and other grain traders were also selling to the communist bloc. First came Hungary, which bought 10 million of American grain in late 1963. Then Cargill dispatched its traders to Moscow to negotiate a bigger deal for 40 million of wheat. The new business with the communist nations was a boom for Cargill. In 1964, the company reported its second highest ever annual profit. The Russian business, it told shareholders, was the underlying spark. The sale of millions of dollars worth of American wheat caused a stir in Washington. Port workers went on strike and refused to load ships taking grains to the Soviet Union, and unions urged their members to boycott Cargill and the other commodity traders. Some lawmakers even tried to block the sales without success. The furor was one of the first demonstrations of the political nature of the commodity trade and the power that the traders were accumulating as pioneers of international commerce. In the course of establishing new trade routes between East and West, Cargill and the other pioneers were driving a commercial rapprochement between the US and the Soviet Union that politicians weren't prepared for. Within a few years, however, the deals with Moscow in 1963-64 would seem like a practice run for a much larger and much more politically explosive series of deals. Cargill's strategy of internationalism was a runaway success. Macmillan, who died in 1960, wouldn't be around to see the company rise to the pinnacle of global trade. But there is a little doubt that it was he who set Cargill on that path. John Macmillan Jr. was a genius who set up the international expansion of Cargill, says David McLeman. The present-day CEO of Cargill, he created the modern company, he says. And then there was Theodor Weisse. If Jesselson and Macmillan were scions of the metals and grain trading industries that had been well established since the 19th century, Weisse was a maverick who invented a new business single-handedly. He had returned from captivity in the Soviet Union after the defeat of Nazi Germany, only to discover that his old job at an oil company no longer existed. That was all the encouragement he needed to follow his dream of creating his own business. To kickstart his new project, he bought a dormant company called Marquand & Balls for 7,000 Reichsmark, the equivalent of about $100,000 in today's money, largely for its import-export license, a thing of value in a country that was still formally under foreign occupation. By the 1950s, when Weisse traveled to Moscow, the company was already well known throughout the primitive market for refined products by its telegraphic address, Mabanaft, a contraction of its trading names, Marquand and Balls, NAFTA products. But Weisse did more than just pioneer a new trade route. He helped to create a new industry where previously there had been none. When Weisse set off for Moscow in 1954, there was no real international oil trade, just a handful of huge companies with near unlimited market power. Oil trading had briefly flourished in the 19th century after the first discovery of oil in America at Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. But the trade abruptly dried up when John Rockefeller bought up control of nearly all the refining capacity in America for his Standard Oil Trust. With only one buyer in town, there was no competition, and so no market. The price of oil was decided by Rockefeller. The US government broke up Standard Oil in 1911, but the oil market continued to be dominated by an oligopoly of large companies that were vertically integrated to include oil wells, refinery, and retail outlets. By the 1950s, the oil market was controlled by 7 large companies. They came to be known as Seven Sisters, the forerunners of the companies that today ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, Chevron, and BP, many of them were the descendants of Standard Oil, created in the wake of its breakup. Crude oil was purchased at posted price set by refiners in each region, a practice that had been started by Rockefeller. International trading outside the oligopoly of these major companies was virtually non-existent. In the early days of the international oil market, the Seven Sisters avoided dealing with independent traders like Weisse, wary of the threat to their market power. Trying to break their clubby control of the oil market required creativity and a spirit of adventure, and Weisse was perfectly suited to the task. Known to his friends as Theo, he was a born adventurer with a taste for exotic travel, who thought nothing of the discomforts of setting out on a business trip for weeks or months at a time to unknown parts of the world. He would fly first class, booking a full row of seats so he could keep in, with several large suitcases full of paperwork that he carried with him everywhere. In 1951, he set off a 3-month voyage through Africa, traveling across a continent that was on the brink of radical upheaval, as former French, Belgian, and British colonies were soon to gain independence. From Tangier and Casablanca, he traveled to Dakar, then Elizabethville and Leopoldville, now Lubumbashi and Kinshasa, in the Belgian Congo. Everywhere he went, he negotiated contracts for Mabanaft to supply the African continent with fuel. When he struck his deals with Moscow, Weisse became the first independent trader to circumvent the oil majors' club and trade crude oil outside their network of control. They punished him for his insolence, refusing to do business with him immediately after his return from the Soviet Union, and they had good reason to be concerned. Weisse's trades not only marked the start of the rise of international oil traders, but also the beginning of a major increase in Soviet oil exports. In 1954, when the Mabanaft boss first traveled to Moscow, Soviet oil production was relatively small and almost entirely consumed within the communist bloc. It was outside the control of the Seven Sisters, but it did not impinge on their empires. Yet the export route that Weisse helped open would soon take an enormous significance for the global oil market. Until the 1950s, the Soviet Union's oil had come largely from Baku on the Caspian Sea, whose riches had been exploited since the 19th century. But now geologists began to develop new deposits in the Volga-Rus Basin, and Soviet oil output doubled between 1955 and 1960. The Soviet Union displaced Venezuela as the second largest oil producer in the world, behind only the US. This geological boom coincided with a shift in political winds in Moscow, and Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, pushed for an increase in foreign trade. Soviet trading agencies such as Soyuznefteexport became more active. Soviet exports of crude oil and refined petroleum products to the so-called Free World rose from a mere 116,000 barrels a day in 1955 to about 1 million barrels a day. In 1965, 10 years later, the oil export campaign became the most visible manifestation of what Western diplomats started to call the Soviet economic offensive. With a little fanfare, the commodity traders were helping to change the world economic order. They were forging trade links between Western markets and suppliers that had previously been sealed off behind the Iron Curtain, and in doing so, they were helping to unpick the oligopolies that controlled many markets. Within a few years, the ripple effects would be felt across the world. Weisse, Jesselson, and Macmillan were not just important because of their economic impact, however, they also created a model for the business of trading commodities that still holds today, where previously traders had focused on particular locations or markets. Mabanaft, Philip Brothers, and Cargill aimed for global mastery of the commodities they traded. Before the Second World War, metal traders such as Philip Brothers had focused on the deals where they could buy a package of metal, having already agreed a deal to sell it onwards. A junkyard might call up the firm and offer to sell it a few hundred tons of scrap metal. It would then send a cable around the other dealers, and if one could be found who was willing to buy at a price that would give Philip Brothers a profit, that company would almost simultaneously agree deals to both buy and sell the metal. Another line of business involved selling on behalf of the producer for a fixed fee per ton. This was safe and predictable business, but had little potential to outsized profits. Under Jesselson, Philip Brothers became more ambitious. The company started doing larger scale and longer term trades. It began to negotiate long-term deals to buy from producers, often in exchange for loans. Now, the company had a global network of supply deals, a trading book that could be extremely profitable when market dislocations caused prices to move sharply up or down. Always have something to sell, explained Ernst Frank, the company's specialist in copper, lead, and zinc. Always be in the business, then sometimes a real shortage develops, and if one has material to sell, one can make real money. So let's stay here and then we continue in the next video. Bye bye.